New details have surfaced about Bryant Dragon Arnold's sudden disappearance from the secret of Skinwalker Ranch, and what insiders claim forced him to walk away is far more unsettling than what the show ever revealed. For 3 seasons, Dragon stood as the ranch's gatekeeper, protector, and enforcer. But behind the scenes, something was happening to him that got progressively worse. Tonight, we uncover the disturbing truth about why he really left. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. From the very beginning of the secret of Skinwalker Ranch, Bryant Dragon Arnold wasn't just a security chief. He was the wall between the crew and whatever lived beneath that cursed mesa. When viewers first met him, he looked like a man who had already seen too much. The folded arms, the cold stare, the clipped answers. Dragon didn't talk like normal guards. He talked like someone who believed the ranch itself was aware, watching, waiting for mistakes. What most people don't realize is that Dragon wasn't hired for TV. He had been on the ranch long before cameras ever showed up. Brandon Fugal trusted him more than anyone else on the property. His job wasn't just to protect the team from trespassers. His job was to protect the outside world from what might slip out. Even in the early episodes, his behavior hinted at someone carrying a secret. While Travis Taylor and the scientists chased anomalies, Dragon stayed back, scanning the tree line like he expected something to step out. He memorized every blind spot, every shadow, every place where the air felt wrong. He rarely smiled, he rarely blinked, and he never let his guard down, even for a second. The crew joked about his seriousness, but insiders claimed it wasn't an act. Dragon had witnessed events that weren't televised, incidents the production company refused to show because they didn't know how to explain them. A nighttime distortion that moved like a solid mass, a figure pacing near Homestead, 2, when no one else was on that side of the property. A sound recorded near the winter shed that technicians described as metal bending underwater. Dragon never told the full stories, but everyone who worked around him knew this. Something had changed him before filming ever began. He treated the ranch not as a location, but as a threat. And over time, that mindset, combined with the things he saw behind closed doors, would become the reason he walked away from the show entirely. Because deep down, Dragon believed the ranch wasn't just dangerous. He believed it was escalating. Dragon never talked much about fear. In fact, most people assumed he didn't feel it. But the moment that began pulling him away from the show, the moment that started the unraveling, happened late one night near the south fence line. It wasn't filmed, it wasn't logged, and it wasn't part of any episode. It was something the crew whispered about in private, lowering their voices like they were afraid the ranch might overhear. That night, Dragon was walking the perimeter with 2 crew members after strange radio interference spiked across every channel. They expected to find trespassers or maybe an equipment malfunction. Instead, the temperature dropped hard and fast, like the air had been sucked out of the valley. The men's breath hung thick in the darkness. Even the insects stopped making sound. That's when Dragon noticed it, an outline standing in front of the ridge, tall, motionless, backlit by nothing but moonlight. At first, he thought it was a shadow. Then it moved, not like a human, not like an animal. It shifted sideways, as if gliding across the ground without stepping. One of the camera operators muttered, "What the hell is that?" But Dragon didn't answer. His hand hovered over his sidearm, not drawing, just bracing. The figure paused in front of the mesa slope, then vanished. Not walked away, not ran. It blinked out. The men stood frozen, but Dragon stepped forward slowly, as if pulled by a force he couldn't explain. He scanned the ridge, ordered the others back, and radioed base. But the radio shrieked, not static, not distortion, an inhuman metallic warping noise that made both men cover their ears. After the interference cleared, Dragon spoke only 2 words: "Shut it." The next morning, he acted like nothing happened, but everyone noticed the change. He stared at the mesa longer. He patrolled in silence. He stopped joking with the camera crew. Something was weighing on him, something he didn't want on tape. Something he didn't want analyzed, replayed, or discussed. And whatever he saw that night near the ridge, it shook the unshakable. It was the first sign that Dragon wasn't just protecting the ranch. He was trying to protect himself from whatever had finally noticed him back. In the weeks after the ridge encounter, Dragon kept insisting everything was fine. Just operational stress, just long hours, just the job. But the crew knew better. They'd worked with him long enough to understand that Dragon only shut down when something truly rattled him. And soon, a second event pushed him further from the show than anyone realized. It happened inside the command trailer, what Dragon used to call his safe place. Nothing strange happened in that trailer. No cold spots, no equipment failures, no unexplained shadows. It was the one building everyone trusted. But one night, shortly after midnight, as Dragon was reviewing drone footage alone, every monitor in front of him froze at the exact same frame. A frame that shouldn't have existed. On every screen, from every angle, the footage showed the same image. A silhouette standing behind Dragon inside the trailer, only a few feet from where he sat. It wasn't tall. It wasn't monstrous. It looked wrong in a completely different way. It looked human, but the proportions were distorted. Too long, too narrow. The angles bent like something was wearing the shape of a human but didn't know how to fit inside it. Dragon spun around instantly, hand on his weapon, but nothing was there. The air behind him was ice cold, almost wet, like he had opened a freezer door. The monitors flickered again. The silhouette was gone. Then, one by one, each screen replayed the last 2 seconds of the footage backward, without any input from him. Dragon hit keys, slammed the power button, yanked the cables, but it didn't matter. The screens stayed on, playing the same impossibly reversed footage of something standing right where he had been sitting. The distortion formed a kind of shape around the figure, like static was outlining it. But the face was the worst part. It was blurred, smeared like wet paint, except 2 dark hollows stared out from the center of it, watching him, evaluating him. By the time the system finally powered down, Dragon was shaken in a way no one had ever seen. When the tech crew checked the equipment the next morning, they found no corrupted files, no glitch logs, no abnormal activity. There was no trace of the silhouette, no evidence the monitors had ever malfunctioned, no proof anything had happened at all. But Dragon knew what he saw, and from that night forward, he refused to stay in the trailer alone. He kept the lights on longer, slept less, and checked the door locks twice as often. Because whatever had appeared behind him wasn't just watching the ranch, it was watching him, and it wanted him to know it. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine nighttime perimeter sweep. Dragon had done hundreds of them, walking the fence line, checking sensors, logging wildlife activity. But this time, the air felt wrong. The moment he stepped outside, even the other security guys later admitted they could feel it too. A heaviness, like the entire ranch was holding its breath. Halfway through the sweep, Dragon radioed in with something strange. His voice wasn't panic, not yet, but it carried an edge the team wasn't used to hearing. "Do you copy? I'm getting movement near Sector C, but it's not tripping the ground sensors." The team checked the system. Dragon was right. No alerts, no thermal spikes, nothing. But he kept whispering that something was pacing him through the trees, staying just out of sight. He said he could hear it. Slow steps, crunching dirt, the soft push of branches. But the thermal drone showed only Dragon. Then, suddenly, he stopped answering the radio. The command trailer erupted with noise, everyone shouting, scrambling to reach him. By the time they arrived at the far corner of the property, they found Dragon standing perfectly still, staring at the old cottonwood tree near the ravine. His flashlight hung loosely in his hand, beam pointed at the ground. His pupils were dilated, his breath shallow, like he had just seen something that didn't belong in this world. One of the crew called his name. Dragon didn't react. It wasn't until Thomas physically grabbed his shoulder that he snapped out of it, gasping like someone had held him underwater. When they asked what happened, he didn't answer. He just kept shaking his head, whispering, "You didn't see it. You didn't see what was there." They searched the area. No footprints, no thermal traces, no broken branches. Nothing that explained the terror still trembling through him. But when they reviewed Dragon's body cam, something even more unsettling emerged. At the exact moment, Dragon stopped responding. The microphone picked up a faint clicking noise. Soft, rhythmic, unnatural. Not an animal, not machinery. Something else. Something responding to him. Then a low, distorted whisper layered under the clicking. "Come back. The audio techs tried to isolate the sound, filter it, enhance it, but the deeper they analyzed it, the stranger it became. The waveform wasn't consistent with any known voice pattern, it wasn't human, and it wasn't mechanical. It was something in between. When they showed Dragon the clip, he refused to listen to it. He walked out of the trailer without saying a word. And later that night, he told the cameras something he'd never admitted before. "I'm not scared of this place because of what it can do. I'm scared because sometimes it feels like it already knows us, knows me." That night, Dragon didn't finish his sweep. For the first time in the show's history, he refused to go back out into the dark. Something had been waiting for him out there, and whatever it was, it wanted him alone. After the incident at the cottonwood tree, Dragon tried to return to work as if nothing had happened, but the crew noticed something immediately. He was different, more guarded, more restless, and for the first time since he joined the team, Dragon started keeping things off record. It began when he insisted on reviewing all overnight surveillance footage alone, hours before the rest of the team arrived. At first, nobody questioned it. They assumed he was trying to make sense of what he'd experienced. But then, the system logs revealed something odd. Several files had been accessed, viewed, and then manually copied into an encrypted folder under Dragon's personal login. Footage that was no longer accessible to anyone else. When asked about it, Dragon brushed it off as routine security archiving, but the explanation didn't sit right. He never did that before, and he certainly never locked the team out of data. Then came the night Brandon Fugal himself flew in, responding to a message Dragon sent privately. The cameras caught their silhouettes inside the command trailer, voices muted, door locked. No one ever learned what Dragon showed him. But when Brandon walked out, he looked rattled, shaken in a way the ranch had never visibly affected him before. The only clue came from the drone operator, who swore he saw Dragon carrying a small metal case out to his truck later that evening, something he had pulled from the restricted storage room where only the highest-level evidence was kept. Whatever was inside it, Dragon placed it gently on the passenger seat and drove off without a word. The next morning, he returned to the ranch pale, exhausted, and refusing to talk about where he had gone. But the change was unmistakable. Dragon had always been strict, intense, sometimes paranoid, but now he was something else entirely. He was afraid, not of intruders, not of trespassers, but of the thing he had locked in that case. Something the ranch had shown him, something he didn't want the others to see, something he feared would change everything if it ever became public. And from that day forward, Dragon stopped trusting the ranch's systems. He stopped trusting the investigation, and worst of all, he stopped trusting the crew. Dragon tried to hide it, but the fear was starting to bleed through his hardened exterior. He stopped walking the property alone. He double-checked every camera angle, every infrared sweep, every motion sensor. He even began carrying 2 radios, something no one had ever seen him do. And still, none of it prepared him for what happened during the final incident that pushed him toward the edge. It began just after sunset. The team was in the command center reviewing the anomalies from the previous night when Dragon abruptly stiffened, staring at the monitor showing the northern fence line. A single motion sensor had triggered, just one, but the cameras picked up nothing. No animals, no vehicles, no movement, just empty darkness. Dragon muttered, "That's not nothing," and grabbed his gear. At first, the others assumed he was going alone again, but he didn't. He stormed out of the trailer, breathing hard, scanning the horizon like something was calling him. When Travis tried to follow, Dragon held up a hand, an unspoken warning. The crew watched him approach the fence line, his flashlight slicing through the growing fog. Everything looked normal, too normal. No footprints, no tracks, no thermal signatures. Then the radios crackled, first with static, then with Dragon's voice, but warped like it was coming through water. "It's here again." The entire command room fell silent. "I can't see it, but it's close. Close enough to..." His voice cut out, replaced by a low distortion that sounded disturbingly like breathing. Travis tried to call him back. No answer. The team sprinted toward his location, their headlights tearing through the night, but before they reached him, The sensors around Dragon began firing in sequence, north, then east, then west, like something was circling him at impossible speed. When they finally reached the fence line, they found Dragon standing rigid, facing the tree line. His flashlight lay at his feet, the beam angled upward like it had been dropped mid-motion. His eyes were wide, not terrified, but furious, like he was staring down something that pushed him past fear and straight into anger. "What did you see?" Thomas asked, panting. Dragon didn't turn, didn't blink. He whispered only one sentence. "It wasn't outside the fence. It was behind me." The team spun around, scanning the empty field. Nothing was there. Not a figure, not a shape, not even a thermal reading. But Dragon wouldn't move, wouldn't even lower his voice. "That thing was close enough to touch me." When they finally escorted him back to the trailer, Dragon locked the door behind him and refused to talk for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he said something that left the entire team stunned. "This ranch isn't reacting to us anymore. It's choosing who it shows itself to." And from the way he said it, they knew who it had chosen. Last, Dragon. After the incident at the fence line, Dragon tried to act normal, walking the perimeter, checking the logs, pretending everything was fine. But the team saw the cracks forming. He stopped cracking jokes. He didn't bark orders as sharply. He avoided certain areas of the ranch entirely, especially the northern stretch, where the radios had distorted his voice. But the breaking point came 3 days later. The night was dead quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. The team was inside reviewing footage when one of the monitors flickered, a glitch that lasted only a second. But in that second, the screen showed something that shouldn't have been there. A silhouette standing directly behind Dragon on footage from the previous night. Tall, thin, featureless. And Dragon had never reported seeing anyone. Thomas froze the frame, zooming in, but the image degraded instantly, like something was actively corrupting it. When Dragon walked into the command center, the room went silent. He saw the frozen image on the screen and stiffened. For a moment, he didn't breathe. "That wasn't there," he muttered. Travis stepped forward. "Dragon, that figure was behind you. You mean to tell me you didn't see anything?" "No," he snapped, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. Then the radios hissed again. Everyone turned. A voice whispered through the static, broken, distant, impossible to place. At first it sounded like interference. Then, unmistakably, it formed a word. "Brian!" The team looked at Dragon, his real name. Only a handful of people ever called him that. The radio crackled again, the whisper stretching into a low, distorted imitation, repeating his name, almost mocking it. Dragon stood frozen, his jaw clenched tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the desk. "That's not interference," Travis said quietly. Dragon didn't answer. He just stared at the speaker, breathing through his teeth like he was holding back a wave of anger or panic. Then the whisper returned, clearer this time, and every hair on the back of Dragon's neck stood up. "Behind you." Dragon spun so fast that he knocked over a chair. Nothing was there. But the moment he turned, the entire command center's temperature dropped, the cameras flickered, and the same silhouette from the still frame appeared again, this time on a live feed, standing exactly where Dragon had just been. When he saw it, Dragon whispered something none of them had ever heard from him before. "I'm done." And for the first time on record, Dragon walked out of the command center without finishing a lockdown. Dragon didn't return to the command center for the rest of the night. He stayed outside alone, pacing along the dirt road that led toward the gate. Every few minutes he would stop, turn sharply, and stare into the tree line, as if expecting something to step out. The team watched him from the monitors, unsure whether to intervene or give him space. But the truth was already settling in. The ranch had crossed a line with him. By sunrise, Dragon was sitting on the tailgate of his truck, shoulders slumped, staring at the ground like a man replaying something in his head over and over again. When Travis approached, Dragon didn't look up. "It's not the ranch," he muttered. "It's me." Travis frowned. "What does that mean?" Dragon took a long breath. "This place, it doesn't follow you. It chooses you." He rubbed his face with both hands. "And something out there chose me a long time ago." It was the closest thing to a confession he'd ever given. He explained carefully that before the show ever aired, before Brandon ever bought the ranch, something appeared to him on the West Ridge during a nighttime patrol, a shimmering distortion, that moved without sound, bending the air around it. He never filed a report, never told the scientists, never mentioned it on camera. "It watched me," he whispered, like it already knew everything about me. The team listened in stunned silence. This wasn't Dragon the security chief talking. This was Brian Arnold, the man behind the persona, finally admitting what he'd hidden for years. "And now, it's back," he finished. "It's following me again." When the crew prepared for the next investigation, Dragon didn't suit up. He walked to Brandon's truck, dropped his security badge onto the hood, and said only one sentence: "If I stay here, it won't stop." He didn't wait for a response. He got into his own truck, turned the engine over, and drove toward the long dirt road leading off the property, the road he had guarded for years. The cameras caught one final shot of him in the rearview mirror, his face pale, eyes fixed on the mesa behind him. A week later, Brandon confirmed privately to the crew Dragon had officially stepped away. No contract dispute, no argument, no falling out with production. He left because something on the ranch wasn't just observing him anymore, it was calling him by name, and he refused to stay long enough to hear what it wanted next. Beneath the rugged terrain of Skinwalker Ranch lies a cabin investigators were never meant to find. A weather-beaten patrol shelter used by the ranch's head of security, known only as Dragon, has now been exposed as far more than a rest stop. What began as a routine patrol post unraveled into a classified containment chamber tied to decades-old psychological studies. What they dug up forced internal security to seal the site, possibly forever. Tonight, we uncover the truth hidden beneath the floorboards and why Dragon may have never been the guard. He was the test subject. Long before anyone on the current research team even knew it existed, the patrol cabin now associated with Dragon sat half-buried in silence at the farthest edge of Skinwalker Ranch. From a distance, it looked harmless, a faded structure with weather-beaten boards, a sagging corrugated roof, and a door that creaked in the wind like any forgotten storage shed meant for emergency supplies or feed sacks. Most new arrivals barely glanced at it. A building like that makes sense on a ranch often battered by storms. It blended in like a scar that time simply stopped noticing, but the silence surrounding it was louder than the wind that rattled its walls. The first sign something was off didn't come from inside, but from above. Years later, when aerial mapping was done for site monitoring, analysts noticed the cabin didn't appear on any historical construction record. No listing, no permits, no maintenance logs, nothing in prior land development files matched its presence. It was as if it wasn't supposed to be there. At first, staff assumed it had been added during the previous ownership transition. But when deeper archives were pulled, government land surveys from decades before showed that exact spot marked as Restricted Research Point, even before Skinwalker Ranch became public. Meaning, the cabin wasn't built where it made sense. It was built where something was already waiting. Satellite scans then revealed a second anomaly. The building's coordinates fell within a classified sensor monitoring zone, one that hadn't been disclosed during acquisition. Yet, no external power lines connected to it, no communications relay, nothing that explained why the site was flagged. Internal employees later admitted they ignored it at first because some locations on the ranch are better left undocumented. But that changed the day Dragon was assigned there, not to protect what was inside, but to unknowingly interact with it. Because someone, somewhere, already knew that the cabin was never meant to serve people. It was meant to study them. When investigators finally entered the cabin with full structural clearance, their first observation was confusion. Ranch buildings are typically assembled with utility in mind: straight beams, salvaged lumber, visible nails, basic insulation. This cabin followed none of those conventions. The interior dimensions measured nearly 3 feet larger than the external foundation, an impossibility without intentionally engineered manipulation. Nails were embedded in spiral configurations rather than linear framing, indicating repeated internal reconstruction, not to repair weather damage, but to modify chamber layout. Someone had rebuilt parts of it from the inside many times, not due to decay, but precision. Underneath the rotting floorboards, something far more alarming emerged: industrial-grade electromagnetic grounding plates, the kind used in classified laboratory environments designed to prevent external signal interference or contamination of energy readings. These plates weren't just installed, they were anchored above soil that appeared chemically sterilized. Multiple layers of metallic shielding were positioned to block frequencies rather than protect from weather. No ranch utility shed would ever require that level of electromagnetic suppression. In fact, it shouldn't even be possible to install such technology that deep without formal contracting, heavy machinery, and recorded power logistics. Yet no construction files existed, no record of delivery trucks, no engineering correspondences, nothing. Environmental sensors inside the cabin displayed temperature fluctuations in exact 5-degree increments at scheduled intervals, regulated with precision akin to controlled lab testing. Dust drifted abnormally, collecting only on surfaces away from hidden sensor alignments. Even the air felt unnaturally dense, as though designed to transmit static memory rather than store humidity. According to sensory log reconstruction, the space behaved less like shelter and more like an active test chamber tuned to interact with living cognitive presence. When the engineering blueprints surfaced through partial digital recovery, the reality became undeniable. The cabin was not built to protect staff from ranch phenomena. It was built to maintain sustained exposure to it. A passive observation box, manipulated to seem harmless, yet designed like a waiting trap with layered influence circuitry embedded into every board and beam. The real question wasn't how it was built without anyone noticing. It was who approved constructing a psychological exposure chamber disguised as a ranch shack. Dragon officially joined the security division, believing his role was standard: monitoring restricted zones, tracking perimeter breaches, deterring trespassers. On paper, his assignment seemed logical. In reality, he had been marked for this role years earlier. Data reconstruction from decrypted research archives revealed that his employment file overlapped with psychological compatibility assessments from a retired Cold War behavioral project. Traits flagged as ideal for long-term exposure testing: emotional restraint, high observational focus, strict adherence to routine, minimal reactive behavior, were identical to what his recruitment form highlighted as professional strengths. This match was not accidental. He fit a pre-established test subject profile. Internal logs recovered beneath the cabin listed those traits under a column labeled Subject Stability Threshold, Phase 3, Qualification. His name never appeared in full. Instead, his initials were cross-referenced next to coded reference strings, suggesting he was evaluated long before he stepped onto the property. What he believed was a standard security screening actually mirrored historical psychological trial formatting from classified personnel conditioning program. Investigators reviewing this alignment stated that he was not hired because he was well suited for security. He was placed because he was suited for influence induction. As months passed, changes in Dragon's personal logbook began reflecting subtle cognitive interference. Entries transitioned from precise, professionally structured reports to fragmented expressions of discomfort, short thoughts, incomplete sentences, increased emotional weight without clear trigger. In isolated recordings, he described sensing shifts in his mood and physical energy when near the cabin. He began noting feelings of being observed without environmental stimuli, unsure whether the pressure came from the land or something within his mind. His handwriting became uneven in extended shifts, aligning with what earlier documents classified as optimal affective disorientation patterns. What makes Dragon's case uniquely tragic is that he never volunteered for any experiment. He never even knew one was occurring. When researchers finally gained system-level clearance to investigate beneath Dragon's patrol cabin, they assumed they'd uncover forgotten wiring, weather damage, or perhaps improperly stored supplies. Instead, lifting the warped floorboards revealed something that did not resemble standard construction at all. A rectangular panel sat embedded deeper than typical foundation depth, sealed with cold industrial bolts that matched no commercial ranch hardware. The bolts were consistent with those used on sealed transport cases for classified laboratory assets, designed to survive high pressure, intense heat, and electromagnetic fluctuation. The panel led to a reinforced metal compartment professionally fabricated and insulated. This was not a repair zone. It was an installation. Inside lay an evidence-style containment tray, organized with the precision of a forensic archive. Each item had been methodically placed, not casually stored. Thick, tinted evidence vials were labeled with non-standard identifiers like ANOMA, ANOMC, and Refuse Human Study. No dates, no signature field, just lettering consistent with internal cataloging codes used in discontinued research programs marked high-risk biocontainment. Next to the vials sat a folded Kevlar pad bearing dried stains. Surface samples returned structure patterns inconsistent with human or registered wildlife blood. Machine analysis flagged the material as unclassified biological origin. Bone fragments were also found, smooth, unnaturally dense, chemically resistant, and slightly luminous under infrared spectrum scanning. The size was too small for any known large fauna, yet density scan suggested impact resistance beyond normal evolutionary design. The final layer contained a microfilm envelope labeled Echo Gateway Failure Report. Its contents detailed electromagnetic exposure testing, cognitive response analytics, and radiation pattern tracking. The last page read, "Subject destabilized. Threshold exceeded. Terminate field sequence." When researchers found Dragon's personal logbook buried deep inside his patrol bag, they expected routine entries, weather updates, ranch security checks, gate scan. What they uncovered instead was the slow unraveling of a man who believed he was simply guarding property, unaware he was the one being studied. Early pages appeared normal: neat handwriting, precise notes on trail status, and motion sensor activation times. But midway through the journal, the tone shifted. Sentences grew shorter, words broke apart, handwriting slanted unevenly as if written with a shaking hand. And then, the timestamps began contradicting themselves. Several entries repeated the exact same minute, but described different emotional states each time. One line read, 0317, felt normal. The next, 0317, pressure behind eyes, like something pushing thoughts into place. Some timestamps were marked days into the future, others looping backwards, mirroring what was later discovered in the compromised security footage. It was as if time inside Dragon's memory didn't follow the outside world. More disturbing were the margin notes. They looked like medical-style observations, written in smaller, more controlled script, as if someone else had added them later. But forensic analysis confirmed it was Dragon's handwriting, only written while his brain was under intense stress. The notes referenced forced cognitive shifting, emotional override, recall disruption patterns. At first, investigators thought he was documenting symptoms. Later, they realized he was mirroring language found in the microfilm experiments beneath the cabin. One passage stopped the review team cold. "Something watches from inside the walls, not with eyes. It waits for me to react before it does. I dream of walking away, but wake up standing in the doorway." The breakthrough came when analysts overlaid Dragon's emotional peaks, recorded in his logbook, with electrical and energy fluctuation reports from devices installed unknowingly inside the cabin wall. What the team discovered still causes silence whenever it's mentioned in internal briefing. Each time Dragon documented a spike in stress, confusion, or sudden emotional collapse, the structural monitoring systems registered sharp electromagnetic surges at the exact same timestamp, down to the second. This meant the environment was not only reacting to him, it appeared to be tracking his mental state in real time. Archived data from the recovered files showed layout diagrams of the cabin labeled Anchor Zone, Cognitive Trigger Line, and Exposure Conduit. These were not ordinary structural markers. They matched terms used during classified Cold War field research involving prolonged isolation and interaction with non-standard environmental stimuli. The cabin, according to these blueprints, wasn't intended to protect him. It was built to encourage contact with an unseen influence. Further review found audio interference synchronized with Dragon's log entries. In recordings captured during his patrols, low-frequency pulses appeared intermittently whenever he expressed heightened fear in writing. Special sound analysis revealed nearly inaudible human-like resonance waves layered beneath the low hum. When separated digitally, these pulses formed rhythm patterns resembling neural response triggers used in cognitive field tests. That meant whatever was affecting him wasn't random. It was behaving as though it was responding. But the most alarming finding wasn't found in audio or electrical logs. It came from thermal mapping scans conducted months after his final entry. The scans revealed a consistent temperature dip, exactly 5 degrees, for 7-minute intervals, matching the precision of Dragon's behavior shifts mentioned in his journal. Exact timing, exact change, every single day. What the team uncovered next was something that had never been discussed on camera, not during official briefings, not even behind closed doors on the ranch. When experts finally processed the microfilm labeled Echo Gateway Failure Report, the contents shattered any remaining assumption that Dragon was merely the first person affected. It revealed there was a previous subject, someone who was never supposed to be mentioned again. The report, dated decades earlier, described an experimental phase that took place long before Skinwalker Ranch became known to the public. The subject was placed in a structure almost identical to Dragon's cabin. Same electromagnetic grid layout, same internal dimensions, same proximity to the anomaly. But unlike Dragon, that individual was not monitored openly. They were monitored remotely. And according to the final line of the failure report, contact escalation exceeded psychological tolerance threshold, resulting in systemic collapse. Nowhere did it mention a rescue attempt. Even more disturbing, temperature logs, behavioral field responses, and radiation interference patterns from that abandoned test perfectly mirrored Dragon's data nearly 40 years later. This implied that whatever force was interacting with him didn't just recognize the setup, it remembered it. It was behaving as if the experiment had restarted. Handwritten in the margin of one microfilm page were the words, "Pattern persists. Entity preference indicates continuity." That simple phrase terrified analysts. It meant what was being studied might not be reacting randomly. It was showing recognition. And then, just beneath that phrase, a final note in faded ink. Subject history must remain undisclosed. Current anchor unaware of precedent. The discovery of the envelope marked "If I don't come back" shifted the entire investigation from scientific analysis into something deeply personal and terrifying. It was not stored inside the locker, where evidence was meant to be kept. Instead, it was hidden behind a thin wooden panel near the back wall, like someone wanted it to remain secret unless things reached a point where returning was no longer an option. The message inside was short, written in Jason Dragon's own handwriting, but it read like the words of someone who no longer trusted his thoughts. He didn't speak about threats the way investigators expected. He didn't refer to a creature or a presence or even a direct danger. Instead, his message described a shift inside himself. He wrote that he began waking up in the cabin without remembering ever lying down. He felt emotional responses that did not match what he was thinking. And most chilling, he believed something was trying to learn through him. He described moments where he felt drawn back toward the cabin after leaving, like his instincts had been reprogrammed. At one point he wrote, "When my mind goes quiet, I feel it try to speak through the silence." That sentence alone broke several researchers emotionally. Next to the note was a small folded photo. It showed Dragon standing outside the cabin during normal patrol, appearing calm and focused. But what was handwritten on the back made experts question whether the person in the picture was even the same man who wrote the letter. The words read, "This is me," before the cabin noticed. The note ended with one final warning, left like a desperate instruction. Do not enter alone. The cabin does not forget who it watches. The final breakthrough came not from letters or hidden compartments, but from the last working camera pointed at the patrol cabin. At first glance, the recordings appeared normal. Quiet nights, still wind, empty ground. But just days before Dragon stopped showing up to work, the footage began displaying anomalies that experts still cannot explain. Time didn't move forward or backward. It began replaying itself differently. A minute of footage would play, then rewind, then repeat, but each time, tiny changes appeared. A rock that had been on one side of the frame would shift inches, even feet, without any visible movement. Tree branches bent at angles differing between loops. In one sequence, the cabin appeared wider than before, and then narrower in the next loop, despite never physically changing. The strangest clip showed a metal toolbox near the entrance, a toolbox that, according to team logs, was not placed there until 3 days after the timestamp on the recording. It was labeled as reverse time footage, reality recorded from the future. When researchers slowed the footage frame by frame, they noticed faint flashes along the screen edges, not camera glare, not insects, and not weather interference. The shapes matched the symbols found in the microfilm labeled Echo Gateway Failure Report, almost like whatever this was, it was trying to communicate. Soon after, things escalated. In one recording, the shadow of the camera pole began to fade until it disappeared altogether, even though the real pole was still standing outside. Then the entire image turned black. No error codes, no static, no signal loss, just silence. Over the next 24 hours, every camera facing the cabin stopped working the same way. Not because the devices broke, because something stopped allowing them to see. The decision was made to seal the cabin permanently. Dragon avoided interviews. The team locked the evidence, and Skinwalker Ranch quietly marked the area as restricted.
New details have surfaced about what Bryant Dragon Arnold's life has become since his sudden disappearance from the secret of Skinwalker Ranch, and what insiders are now revealing is far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. For 3 seasons, Dragon stood as the ranch's protector, its enforcer, the man who guarded the boundary between our world and whatever waited beyond it. But something happened to him out there, something that didn't just push him away from the cameras, something that followed him home. Tonight, we uncover the tragic reality of Dragon's life after Skinwalker Ranch, and why those who knew him say he's never been the same. The ranch didn't just change Dragon, it marked him, and according to people close to the situation, that mark has become a curse he can't escape. What you're about to hear goes beyond anything shown on television. This is the story of a man who dedicated everything to protecting others from the unknown, only to become its primary target. From unexplained encounters that were never filmed, to the psychological breakdown that forced him to walk away, to the haunting reality of his life today. Dragon's story is a warning about what happens when you stare too long into the abyss, and the abyss decides to stare back. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Bryant Arnold wasn't supposed to disappear. He was the kind of man who seemed permanent, rooted to the land like the mesa itself. For years, he was more than just security. He was the last line of defense, the one person Brandon Fugal trusted above all others to keep the ranch secure. Dragon didn't just protect the property from trespassers or curious tourists. He protected the world from what lived beneath that cursed ground. His presence alone was a deterrent, not just to people, but to whatever forces seemed to pulse through that valley. But in the spring of his final season, something fundamental changed. The crew noticed it first. Dragon stopped engaging in casual conversation. He avoided the command center unless absolutely necessary. He triple-checked locks on doors that had never needed checking before. His patrols became longer, more erratic, as if he was searching for something or running from something he couldn't name. And then one morning, without any warning or explanation, he drove off the property and never came back. No press release, no farewell episode, no official statement, just gone. What most people don't know is that Dragon didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because staying meant losing himself completely, surrendering to something that had been circling him for years. And according to those close to him, that surrender is exactly what's happening now. The man who once seemed unshakable has become a shadow of his former self, haunted by experiences that refuse to stay buried. Dragon's disappearance wasn't an ending. It was an escape attempt, and tragically, it didn't work. Dragon's unraveling didn't start when the cameras were rolling. It started years before, during his earliest earliest patrols on the ranch, long before the show ever aired. Back then, he reported strange disturbances to Brandon Fugal, things he couldn't easily explain or rationalize. Lights that moved against the wind direction, shadows that stretched impossibly long across the ground at noon, cold spots that appeared without warning in the middle of summer heat. And one night, alone on the West Ridge during a routine patrol, he saw it for the first time. A shimmering distortion hovering several feet above the ground, twisting the air around it like heat rising from asphalt on a scorching day. But the temperature wasn't hot. It was freezing cold. Dragon froze in place. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't radio for help. He didn't move at all. He just stood there in the darkness, watching as the thing watched him back. There was an intelligence to it, a presence that felt aware and calculating. Then, without warning, it vanished. Not faded gradually, not drifted away. It simply ceased to exist, like someone had flipped a switch and removed it from reality. Dragon never filed an official report about the incident, never told the scientists what he'd witnessed, never mentioned it on camera or in any interview. But from that night forward, he carried himself differently, like a man who knew he'd been marked, tagged, chosen for something he couldn't yet understand. And as the years passed and the show began filming, Dragon realized with growing dread that he was right. Whatever had watched him that night on the West Ridge hadn't forgotten him. It was waiting, observing, planning its next move. The moment that truly began pulling Dragon away from the show happened late one night near the south fence line. During what should have been a routine perimeter check, Dragon was walking the property with two crew members after strange radio interference spiked across every channel simultaneously. They expected to find trespassers, maybe teenagers trying to sneak onto the property, or perhaps just an equipment malfunction. Instead, the temperature dropped so hard and so fast that all three men's breath hung thick in the air like dense fog. Even the insects stopped making sound. The silence was oppressive, unnatural, wrong. That's when Dragon noticed it. A tall figure standing motionless on the ridge, silhouetted against the night sky, backlit by nothing but pale moonlight. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, his mind filling in patterns where none existed. Then it moved, not like a human being, not like any animal he'd ever tracked. It shifted sideways across the ground without taking a single step, gliding as if the laws of physics didn't apply to it. One of the camera operators whispered urgently, "What the hell is that?" But Dragon didn't answer. His hand hovered over his sidearm, not drawing the weapon, just bracing himself for whatever might come next. The figure paused at the base of the mesa slope, seeming to regard them with invisible eyes. Then it vanished, not walked away into the darkness, not ran. It simply blinked out of existence like a light being switched off. Dragon stepped forward slowly, almost against his will, as if pulled by a force he couldn't explain or resist. He scanned the ridge methodically, ordered the others to fall back to a safe distance, and attempted to radio base. But the radio shrieked with a metallic warping noise that made both men cover their ears in pain. After the interference finally cleared, Dragon spoke only 2 words into the radio. "Shut it down!" The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened, but everyone on the crew noticed the fundamental change in him. He stared at the mesa longer during his patrol. He stopped joking with the camera crew, and something deep inside him had shifted permanently. Several weeks after the ridge encounter, Dragon was working late, reviewing drone footage alone in the command trailer, what he used to call his safe place. Nothing strange ever happened in that trailer. No cold spots, no equipment failures, no unexplained shadows. It was the one building on the entire property that everyone trusted implicitly. But one night, shortly after midnight, as Dragon sat reviewing surveillance footage in complete solitude, every monitor in front of him froze simultaneously on the exact same frame, a frame that by all logic shouldn't have existed. On every screen, from every camera angle throughout the property, the footage showed the exact same impossible image, a silhouette standing directly behind Dragon inside the trailer, only a few feet from where he currently sat. It wasn't tall or monstrous in the traditional sense, but the proportions were fundamentally wrong, too long, too narrow. The angles bent unnaturally, like something was wearing the shape of a human being, didn't understand how to properly fit inside it. Dragon spun around instantly, hand reaching for his weapon, every muscle tensed for confrontation, but nothing was there. The space behind him was completely empty, yet the air in that spot was ice cold, almost wet, like he'd suddenly opened a freezer door in a humid room. The monitors flickered erratically. The silhouette disappeared from the screen. Then, one by one in sequence, each screen began replaying the last 2 seconds of footage backward without any input from Dragon whatsoever. He hit keys frantically, slammed the power button repeatedly, physically yanked cables from their connection, but it didn't matter. Nothing he did made any difference. The screen stayed on, continuing to play impossibly reversed footage of something standing in the exact spot where he had been sitting moments before. The distortion formed a kind of outline around the figure, like static electricity was tracing its edges. But the face was the absolute worst part, blurred and smeared like wet paint dragged across canvas, except two dark hollows stared out from the center of it, watching him with terrible focus, evaluating him like a specimen. By the time the system finally powered down completely, Dragon was shaken in a way no one on the crew had ever witnessed before. When the tech team checked all the equipment the next morning, they found absolutely nothing. No corrupted files, no glitch logs, no abnormal activity recorded anywhere in the system. There was no trace of the silhouette, no evidence the monitors had ever malfunctioned, no proof that anything unusual had happened at all. But Dragon knew exactly what he had seen, and from that night forward, he absolutely refused to stay in the command trailer alone under any circumstances. The breaking point came during what should have been just another routine nighttime perimeter sweep. Dragon had completed hundreds of these walks over the years, checking fence lines, monitoring sensors, logging wildlife activity. It was muscle memory by that point. But this particular night, the air felt fundamentally wrong from the moment he stepped outside. Even the other security personnel later admitted they could feel it too. A heaviness pressing down on everything, like the entire ranch was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Halfway through the sweep, Dragon radioed in with something unusual. His voice wasn't panicked, not yet, but it carried an edge the team wasn't accustomed to hearing from him. "Do you copy? I'm getting movement near Sector C, but it's not tripping any of the ground sensors." The command team immediately checked the monitoring system. Dragon was absolutely right. No alerts, no thermal spikes, no motion detection, nothing registering on any equipment, but he kept whispering into the radio that something was pacing him through the trees, staying just barely out of direct sight. He said he could hear it clearly. Slow, deliberate steps, the sound of boots crunching on dirt, the soft push and snap of branches being moved aside. But the thermal drone circling overhead showed only Dragon's heat signature, nothing else. Without warning or explanation, he stopped answering the radio entirely. The command trailer erupted with noise, everyone shouting, scrambling, trying desperately to reach him. By the time the rapid response team arrived at the far corner of the property, they found Dragon standing perfectly still beside the old cottonwood tree near the ravine. His flashlight hung loosely in his hand, beam pointed uselessly at the ground. His pupils were massively dilated despite the bright lights now surrounding him. His breathing was shallow and rapid, like someone who had just witnessed something that shattered their understanding of reality. One of the crew members called his name repeatedly. Dragon didn't react at all. It wasn't until Thomas physically grabbed his shoulder and shook him that Dragon finally snapped out of whatever trance held him, gasping desperately like someone who'd been held underwater for too long. When they frantically asked what had happened, what he'd seen out there in the darkness, he didn't answer coherently. He just kept shaking his head violently, whispering over and over, "You didn't see it. You didn't see what was standing there." The team searched the entire area methodically. No footprints in the soft earth, no thermal traces lingering, no broken branches, absolutely nothing that could explain the absolute terror still trembling through Dragon's body. But when they later reviewed Dragon's body cam footage, something even more deeply unsettling emerged from the recording. At the exact moment Dragon stopped responding to radio calls, the microphone picked up a faint clicking noise in the background, completely unnatural. Not an animal sound, not machinery, something else entirely. Something that seemed to be responding directly to his presence. Then underneath the clicking, barely audible, a low, distorted whisper emerged. Audio technicians tried desperately to isolate the sound, filter it, enhance it, understand its origin. But the deeper they analyzed the waveform, the stranger it became. The pattern wasn't consistent with any known human voice. It wasn't mechanical interference. It existed somewhere in between, something that shouldn't be possible. When they showed Dragon the isolated audio clip, he refused to listen to it. After the terrifying incident at the cottonwood tree, Dragon attempted to return to his normal work routine as if nothing significant had happened, but the crew immediately noticed something had fundamentally changed. He was more guarded than ever before, more restless, constantly looking over his shoulder, and for the first time since joining the team years ago, Dragon started keeping critical information off the official record. It began when he insisted on reviewing all overnight surveillance footage completely alone, arriving hours before the rest of the team each morning. At first, first, nobody questioned this behavior. They assumed he was simply trying to make sense of his recent experiences, searching for patterns or explanations. But then the system logs revealed something deeply odd and concerning. Several files had been accessed, viewed multiple times, and then manually copied into a heavily encrypted folder under Dragon's personal login credential. Footage that was suddenly no longer accessible to anyone else on the team, including Brandon Fugal himself. When confronted about this unusual behavior, Dragon brushed it off dismissively as routine security archiving, standard protocol for sensitive material. But the explanation didn't sit right with anyone. He had never done anything like this before in all his years on the property, and he certainly had never locked the investigative team out of potentially crucial data. Then came the night that truly alarmed everyone. Brandon Fugal himself flew in urgently from Salt Lake City, responding to a private message Dragon had sent him directly, bypassing all normal communication channels. The cameras caught their silhouettes inside the command trailer late that night, voices deliberately muted, door firmly locked from the inside. No one on the crew ever learned what Dragon showed Brandon during that secret meeting, but when Brandon finally emerged hours later, he looked visibly rattled, shaken in a way the ranch had never affected him before despite years of bizarre occurrences. The only real clue came from the drone operator, who later swore under oath that he saw Dragon carefully carrying a small metal case out to his personal truck later that evening, something he had retrieved from the restricted storage room where only the highest level evidence was kept under lock and key. Whatever was contained inside that case, Dragon handled it with extreme care, placing it gently on the passenger seat as if it were fragile or dangerous, and then drove off the property without explaining anything to anyone. The next morning when he returned, Dragon was pale, visibly exhausted, and absolutely refusing to discuss where he had gone or what he had done with the contents of that case. But the change in him was unmistakable and deeply troubling. Dragon had always been strict, intense, occasionally paranoid about security, but now he was something else entirely. He was genuinely afraid, not of intruders or trespassers or even the unknown phenomena. He was terrified of something specific, something the ranch had shown him, something he had locked in that metal case, something he desperately feared would change everything if it ever became public knowledge. And from that day forward, Dragon stopped trusting the ranch's monitoring systems entirely. He stopped trusting the investigation's methodology and conclusions. And worst of all, he stopped trusting the crew members he had worked alongside for years. The night everything finally fell apart began quietly enough. The team was gathered in the command center, carefully reviewing anomalies from the previous night's investigation, when one of the central monitors suddenly flickered without warning, just for a single second, barely noticeable. But in that brief moment, the screen displayed something that sent ice through everyone's veins, a frame that absolutely should not exist anywhere in their footage. On the monitor, clear as day, was an image showing a silhouette standing directly behind Dragon in footage recorded the previous night. Tall, unnaturally thin, completely featureless, and Dragon had never reported seeing anyone or anything during that patrol. When Dragon walked into the command center moments later and immediately saw the frozen image still displayed on the screen, he went completely rigid. Every muscle in his body tensed. For several long seconds, he didn't even appear to breathe. "That wasn't there," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Travis stepped forward carefully, studying both the screen and Dragon's reaction. "Dragon, that figure was standing directly behind you in this footage. Are you seriously telling us you didn't see anything unusual during this patrol?" "No," Dragon snapped defensively, but the crack in his voice completely betrayed him. He was lying, or he was in denial, or something far worse. Then the command center radios suddenly hissed with harsh static. Everyone in the room turned toward the speakers simultaneously. A voice whispered through the interference, broken and distant, seemingly impossible to pinpoint or identify. At first, it sounded like random interference, atmospheric noise, radio bounce. Then, unmistakably, crystal clear despite the static, it formed a single word: Brian. The entire team immediately looked at Dragon. His real name, his birth name, only a small handful of people in his entire life ever called him that. Everyone on the ranch knew him exclusively as Dragon. The radio crackled again, louder this time. The whisper stretched and distorted, taking on an unnatural quality, almost mocking in its tone as it repeated his name slowly. Brian. Dragon stood completely frozen, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. "That's not normal interference," Travis said quietly, stating the obvious that everyone was thinking. Dragon didn't answer. He couldn't answer. He just stared at the radio speaker, breathing hard through clenched teeth, looking like he was holding back either rage or panic or both. Then the whisper returned one final time, clearer than before. and every single hair on the back of Dragon's neck visibly stood up. 2 words that would haunt him forever. Behind you. Dragon spun around so violently and so fast that he knocked over an expensive equipment chair, sending it crashing to the floor. Nothing was there. The space behind him was completely empty, but the precise moment he turned, the entire command center's temperature dropped at least 20 degrees in seconds. People's breath became visible. The monitoring cameras flickered erratically, and then the same silhouette from the frozen footage appeared again, but this time on a live feed broadcasting in real time, standing in the exact spot where Dragon had been positioned just seconds before. When Dragon saw his own image on the screen with that thing standing where he'd just been, he whispered something that absolutely no one on the crew had ever heard from him before in all their years working together. "I'm done." And for the first time in the entire recorded history of the show, Dragon turned and walked out of the command center without completing a security lockdown protocol. Dragon didn't return to the command center that night. He stayed outside alone, pacing the dirt road toward the gate. Every few minutes he would stop, turn sharply, and stare into the tree line like he expected something to step out. The team watched from monitors, unsure whether to intervene. By sunrise, Dragon was sitting on his truck's tailgate, shoulders slumped, staring at the ground. When Travis approached, Dragon didn't look up. "It's not the ranch," he muttered. "It's me." Travis frowned. "What does that mean?" Dragon took a long breath. "This place doesn't follow you. It chooses you, and something out there chose me a long time ago." He explained that before the show ever aired, before Brandon bought the ranch, something appeared to him on the West Ridge, a shimmering distortion that moved without sound. He never filed a report, never told anyone. "It watched me," he whispered, like it already knew everything about me. The team listened in stunned silence. "And now it's back," he said. "It's following me again." When the crew prepared for the next investigation, Dragon didn't suit up. He walked to Brandon's truck, dropped his security badge on the hood, and said only one sentence: "If I stay here, it won't stop." He climbed into his truck and drove toward the gate. The cameras caught one final shot in his rearview mirror. His face pale, eyes fixed on the mesa behind him. 1 week after Dragon drove off Skinwalker Ranch for the final time, Brandon Fugal quietly confirmed what everyone already knew. Dragon had officially stepped away. No contract dispute, no salary negotiation. He left because something wasn't just observing him anymore. It was calling him by name. But leaving didn't end it. According to those who've seen him since, Dragon's life has become unrecognizable. He lives alone now, far from Utah, in a location he refuses to reveal. Friends say he's reclusive, distrustful of electronics, paranoid about being watched. He checks windows obsessively. He sleeps with lights on. He refuses to discuss the ranch. One former crew member reached him by phone last year. Dragon answered but said only 3 words before hanging up: "It's still here." Others report he's moved multiple times, always at night, always without warning, like he's running from something that won't let go. The tragedy of Bryant Arnold isn't that he left Skinwalker Ranch. It's that part of the ranch left with him. And no matter how far he runs, whatever chose him that night on the West Ridge is still watching, still waiting, still calling his name in the dark. Brandon Fugal has never evacuated Skinwalker Ranch. Through 5 seasons of aerial phenomenon, underground discoveries, crew hospitalizations, and instrument readings that dismantled every conventional explanation his scientific team applied to them, the investigation kept moving, until the drilling operation reached something that responded, not resisted, responded. And Brandon Fugal made a decision that nobody in the investigation's history has ever made before. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what responded to that drill changed everything. Brandon Fugal's ownership of Skinwalker Ranch has been defined by a single operational commitment that has distinguished his investigation from every prior program that engaged seriously with the property: the commitment to continuation. Where the Sherman family eventually reached the limit of what sustained exposure to the ranch's phenomenon could ask of a family trying to maintain an ordinary life and sold. Where the NIDS program eventually exhausted the resources and the institutional patience that Robert Bigelow's private funding could sustain and wound down. Where the AAWSAP initiative eventually reached the point at which the classified research program's findings had produced a body of evidence that the government determined required management rather than continued investigation, and discontinued. Fugal kept going. The investigation he built around the property was designed specifically to outlast the forces that had stopped every prior program: the financial pressure, the institutional resistance, the personal toll, and the specific quality of sustained anomalous exposure that the ranch produces in the people who spend serious time on it. The monitoring infrastructure he installed runs continuously. The scientific team he assembled has the professional credentials to withstand the institutional skepticism that prior programs encountered. The broadcast format he chose gives the investigation a public accountability that private programs never had. Every design decision was oriented toward the same outcome, keeping the investigation moving regardless of what the ranch produced. That commitment has been tested across 5 seasons. The aerial phenomenon that defies every aerodynamic principle, the investigation's aerospace credentialed team applies to it. The underground structures whose geometric consistency no geological model accounts for. The crew members whose medical evacuations documented physical effects that attending physicians could not attribute to any known environmental cause. The instrument readings whose values Travis Taylor has been choosing every public word about with the specific care of a physicist who knows what his data is showing and understands the implications of stating it plainly. Through all of it, the investigation kept moving. The evacuation that this video documents is the first time in 5 seasons of investigation that the decision to stop, not pause, not suspend a session, but evacuate, was made. What produced that decision is what the drilling operation reached. And what the drilling operation reached responded to being reached in a way that made evacuation the only responsible choice. The Skinwalker Ranch drilling operation is the investigation's most direct attempt to physically access the underground formation that the sonar and ground-penetrating radar work of the middle seasons established as the property's most significant and most anomalous feature. The sonar returns from beneath the mesa that produced the investigation's first clear picture of the underground environment, identified significant structured voids at depths whose geometry was inconsistent with natural cave formation, too consistent in their proportions, too regular in their arrangement, and too specifically located at positions corresponding to the surface zones of maximum electromagnetic anomaly to be accounted for by the natural dissolution processes that produce cave systems in comparable geological environments. The drilling operation was designed to close the distance between the investigation's instrument-based knowledge of the underground formation and the physical reality of what the instruments had been mapping. The approach methodology developed across the operation's prior attempts, the lateral entry angles that avoided the direct vertical descents whose resistance events had terminated earlier drilling efforts, the geological assessments that identified the formation boundary zones where penetration was most viable, and the instrument monitoring that tracked the formation's response to the drilling in real time, had produced progressively more successful approaches to the underground structures with each season's operational iteration. The resistance that the formation had produced in response to prior drilling attempts had been the most consistent evidence that whatever was underground was not indifferent to the investigation above it. Equipment failures at specific depths, whose mechanical analysis produced no conventional explanation, flooding events that filled bore holes precisely when the drilling reached the depth boundaries of the most significant underground features, electromagnetic interference that disabled drilling instrumentation in the approach zones with a timing and a specificity that correlated directly with the underground formation's mapped position. All of that prior resistance had been calibrated to the capability of the drilling operation that produced it, increasing in intensity as the operation's methodology improved and decreasing in specificity as the operation's approach changed in ways that apparently required adjustment. The evacuation that this video documents occurred because the most recent drilling approach did not encounter resistance in the pattern the prior attempts had established. It encountered something different, not the familiar resistance of the formation pushing back against the approach, something that the formation did in response to the drilling reaching a specific point in the underground structure that was not resistance in any conventional sense. It was response. And the distinction between those two things is the most significant thing about what the drilling operation just reached. The drilling session that produced the response whose documentation led to the evacuation decision was not approached as a routine operational advancement of the prior approach methodology. It was approached as the most significant drilling session in the investigation's history, because the instrument data from the monitoring infrastructure running continuously across the property in the weeks preceding the session had been showing changes in the underground formation's detectable characteristics that the technical team had assessed as indicating a shift in the formation's state, rather than a continuation of the escalating pattern the prior season's monitoring had established. The electromagnetic readings from the active zones above the formation had reorganized in the geographic distribution pattern that the geophysicist's assessment had characterized as consistent with a change in the source geometry of whatever was generating the surface anomalies. The vibration signatures from the underground sensors had been showing the repeating temporal structure whose mechanical precision the prior assessment had established as inconsistent with any geological process in the reference literature. And the perimeter monitoring data had been producing readings whose correspondence to the approach vector established in the prior perimeter sweep analysis indicated that whatever was operating across the broader Uinta Basin had been increasing its activity in the specific section of the property whose underground position corresponded to the drilling operation's current target. The session began with the full monitoring infrastructure running at its maximum deployment configuration, every instrument category active, every camera unit positioned, and the scientific team's full analytical attention directed at the real-time data stream from the sensors closest to the drilling operation's current approach position. The first hour of the session produced instrument readings that the technical team's field notes characterize as the most concentrated simultaneous anomaly across multiple independent measurement categories that the investigation had recorded at any prior drilling session. Not individually the most extreme readings the investigation had ever logged. Specific prior sessions had produced higher peak values in individual instrument categories, but the simultaneous elevation across every instrument category at once, in a spatial distribution that the technical team's analysis established as centered on the drilling operation's current position, was a pattern whose character was different from the escalating response pattern the prior sessions had produced. Something was paying attention to exactly where the drill was, and then the drill reached the depth that produced the response. The specific depth at which the drilling operation produced the response that led to the evacuation corresponds to the upper boundary of the primary void structure that the sonar mapping had identified as the most significant underground feature beneath the mesa, the feature whose dimensions, geometric consistency, and electromagnetic correspondence with the surface anomaly distribution had made it the primary target of the drilling operation's progressive approach across multiple seasons. What happened when the drill reached that depth is what Travis Taylor's description of the session, delivered in the specific language of a physicist whose professional discipline demands precision about what the measurements established and restraint about what they implied, characterizes as unlike anything the investigation's monitoring infrastructure had previously recorded at any depth in any prior drilling session. The electromagnetic readings across the monitoring network did not spike in the escalating resistance pattern the prior sessions had established as the formation's response to the drilling approach. They shifted simultaneously across every sensor in the network, in a coordinated pattern whose geographic distribution changed from the locally elevated distribution that the approach had been producing to a basin-wide elevation that the network's full geographic extent captured at once, every sensor simultaneously, shifting from a locally concentrated pattern to a basin-wide one in a transition whose speed the monitoring data documents as occurring between consecutive data points in the recording, present in one configuration in one data frame, present in a different configuration in the next, with no transitional period. The acoustic sensors registered the simultaneous transition in the infrasound range, a shift from the repeating temporal structure the prior monitoring had been logging to a single sustained signal whose frequency and whose internal structure the audio specialist characterized in real time as unlike anything in the prior investigation's acoustic record. The ground vibration sensors logged a signature at the target depth that was not the mechanical vibration of the drilling equipment encountering geological resistance. It was something else, something that the vibration analysis characterizes as emanating from within the void structure, rather than from the geological material surrounding it, a signature consistent with a large-scale physical event occurring inside the underground space rather than in the formation surrounding. The source of that event is inside the underground structure that the drilling operation had just reached the boundary of, and the event's occurrence in direct temporal correspondence with the drill reaching that boundary is what produced the response designation rather than the resistance designation in the investigation team's characterization of what the session documented. The 11 minutes between the drill reaching the target depth and Brandon Fugal making the evacuation decision are documented in the investigation's complete session record across every instrument category and every camera unit running at the time. What those 11 minutes contain, the specific sequence of developments in the monitoring data, the physical environment of the property, and the investigation team's direct experience of what was occurring at the session site, is the body of evidence on which the evacuation decision was based, and whose character Fugal has characterized in the limited public references to the session as unlike anything in 5 seasons of investigation at the most anomalous property in American research history. The electromagnetic shift that occurred when the drill reached the target depth did not stabilize at its new basin-wide configuration. It continued changing, not returning toward the prior localized distribution but moving further from it, with the basin-wide elevation increasing in intensity across the full monitoring network in a directional movement whose rate the technical team's real-time analysis characterized as accelerating rather than approaching a new equilibrium. Whatever the drilling had triggered was not producing a one-time response and returning to its prior state. It was building. The thermal monitoring at the property surface documented a temperature anomaly that developed in the mesa zone in the minutes following the drill's depth breakthrough, an elevation in the ambient thermal environment of the mesa's surface whose magnitude and whose geographic extent the prior monitoring baseline identified as without precedent in the investigation's surface thermal record. The mesa was warming, not dramatically. The differential was measurable rather than immediately perceptible to the investigators present, but measurable across the full surface extent of the mesa formation in a pattern consistent with heat transmission from below, from something in the underground formation that had changed its thermal state in correspondence with the drilling reaching its boundary. The physical effects on the investigation team members present at the session site in the 11 minutes following the depth breakthrough are the element of the evacuation record that Fugal has been most careful about in his public references to the session. Multiple team members reported effects whose character and whose timing, corresponding directly to the onset of the electromagnetic shift and the thermal anomaly, placed them in the category of the investigation's documented physical effect events. Not dramatic, not acute in the way that prior crew medical incidents had been acute, but present, simultaneous across multiple individuals, and developing in intensity across the 11-minute window in a progression that the investigation's accumulated experience with the physical effects of the ranch's active zones gave Fugal the specific context to assess as requiring a response before the progression continued further. Brandon Fugal made the evacuation decision at the 11-minute mark of the post-breakthrough monitoring window. The decision was not made through a formal consultation process or a committee review of the session data. It was made by Fugal directly, communicated to the session team immediately, and implemented without the deliberation that decisions of comparable operational significance in the investigation's prior history had typically involved. The speed of the decision reflects something about the character of what the 11 minutes had produced in a man whose 5 seasons of sustained engagement with the most anomalous property in American research history had given him a reference framework for assessing when the investigation was operating within conditions it was equipped to manage and when it was not. Fugal's reference framework has been built across 5 seasons of decisions about how far to push the investigation in response to what the ranch produces. Decisions whose accumulated record across the broadcast seasons communicates a consistent judgment that the investigation should advance toward whatever the ranch generates rather than away from it. He has made that judgment in the face of crew medical incidents, equipment destructions, aerial encounters, and underground resistance events whose cumulative effect on the investigation's operational context has been absorbed and continued. What the 11 minutes following the drill's depth breakthrough produced in Fugal that made the evacuation decision different from every prior decision in the investigation's history is the distinction that makes the evacuation significant. The prior decisions, the decisions to keep moving in the face of everything the ranch had produced, were made in the context of a phenomenon that was producing its outputs in the investigation's vicinity, without directing them at the investigation specifically. The 11 minutes following the depth breakthrough produced something whose character the monitoring data and the direct experience of the team members present established as directed: the basin-wide electromagnetic shift, the mesothermal anomaly, the simultaneous physical effects on multiple team members, their simultaneous onset in direct correspondence with the drilling reaching the target depth, their progressive intensification across the 11-minute window, and their geographic concentration on the investigation's specific position all indicated a response whose source was aware of exactly where the drilling operation was and was producing its outputs in direct correspondence with what the drilling had done. Fugal evacuated because the investigation had produced something that was responding to it rather than simply occurring around it, and the appropriate response to a phenomenon that has demonstrated awareness of your investigation is to assess what you have documented before continuing to do the thing that produced the response. Travis Taylor's analysis of the session data from the drilling response event is the scientific foundation on which the investigation's understanding of what the 11 minutes documented is being built. And his characterization of what the analysis has produced is the most significant scientific communication about the Skinwalker Ranch investigation that has been made in the public record since his involvement with the property began. Taylor applied his full professional methodology to the session data, the systematic process of conventional explanation elimination, whose output he treats as the necessary precondition for entertaining unconventional interpretation, and whose application to the Skinwalker Ranch evidence across 5 seasons has progressively reduced the range of conventional explanations available for what the investigation's instruments have been detecting. The electromagnetic shift analysis produced the finding that Taylor has characterized in his public references to the session with the most direct language he has applied to any single piece of Skinwalker Ranch evidence across his seasons on the property. The simultaneous basin-wide reconfiguration of the electromagnetic monitoring network's readings in the interval between consecutive data points is not consistent with any electromagnetic propagation mechanism in the physical literature. Electromagnetic fields do not reorganize instantaneously across geographic scales of the magnitude the session data documents. The propagation of electromagnetic effects through any medium occurs at finite velocity, at the speed of light through vacuum, at reduced velocities through conductive and lossy media. The monitoring network's geographic extent is large enough that instantaneous reconfiguration across its full span is not physically possible through any known electromagnetic mechanism. What the data shows happened is not something that known physics permits. Taylor's characterization of that finding, delivered in the restrained, precisely chosen language that his professional discipline demands, is the closest he has come in 5 seasons of public communication about the ranch's evidence to saying plainly that what the investigation's instruments documented is operating outside the known physical framework. The vibration analysis produced a complementary finding whose implication Taylor characterizes with comparable directness. The source of the vibration signature logged at the target depth is inside the underground void structure, not in the geological material at the void's boundary, inside the void. Something inside the underground space that the drilling operation reached the boundary of produced a physical event in direct temporal correspondence with the drilling reaching that boundary. The event's characteristics are documented. Its source location is established. Its correspondence with the drilling's depth breakthrough is beyond coincidence in the statistical sense. What produced it, what is inside that underground space, and why the drilling reaching its boundary produced the response the session documented is the question that the investigation's next phase must answer. Taylor's analysis has established what the question is with more precision than any prior season's investigation has achieved. Answering it is what the evacuation bought time to prepare for. The evacuation is not a conclusion. Fugal has been explicit. The investigation has not stopped, the property has not been abandoned, and the drilling operation has not been terminated. What the evacuation produced is a pause whose purpose is the development of a revised operational framework that reflects what the session established about the nature of what the underground formation does when the drilling reaches its primary boundary. The prior framework was designed around a formation that resisted. The new framework must be designed around a formation that responds. Those are different operational challenges. The response profile the session documented, the instantaneous basin-wide electromagnetic reconfiguration, the simultaneous mesothermal output, the concurrent physical effects on multiple team members, constitutes a detailed picture of what the formation produces when its boundary is reached. The boundary penetration that comes next will be the most significant single operational decision in the investigation's history. What happens when the drilling enters the interior of the underground space is unknown. The evacuation bought time to prepare for that unknown, with the full weight of what the session established about what is waiting on the other side. 5 seasons of Skinwalker Ranch investigation documented a phenomenon that resisted. Resistance is passive, the phenomenon declining to be reached. What the drilling session documented is not resistance. It is response, active, directed, calibrated to the specific action that produced it, and produced at a scale the prior resistance events never approached. The distinction matters more than anything the investigation has previously established. A phenomenon that resists can be mapped and progressively understood. A phenomenon that responds has demonstrated awareness specific enough to produce directed output in correspondence with a specific action at a specific location. Whatever is inside the underground formation knows the drilling reached its boundary. It responded to prove it. The evacuation is the investigation's acknowledgement of what that demonstration means. The drilling that goes back into the ground will go back knowing that what is on the other side of the boundary knows it is coming. That knowledge is the most significant thing 5 seasons of Skinwalker Ranch investigation has ever produced. And what the drilling finds when it crosses the boundary with that knowledge is what every prior season has been building toward. Brandon Fugal has never locked down Skinwalker Ranch. Through 5 seasons of aerial phenomenon, underground discoveries, crew hospitalizations, and instrument readings that dismantled every conventional explanation his scientific team applied to them, the gates stayed open and the investigation kept moving. Until now, scientists on the property confirmed something this week that produced a lockdown decision that nobody in the investigation's history has ever made before. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what they confirmed is the reason. Brandon Fugal's identity as the owner and driving force behind the Skinwalker Ranch investigation is built on a specific and consistent quality that has defined every season of the broadcast record: the quality of continuation. Where the Sherman family eventually left, where the NIDS program eventually wound down, where the AAWSAP initiative eventually had its funding discontinued, Fugal has kept moving. The investigation he inherited when he purchased the property from Robert Bigelow in 2016 came with a documented history of every prior program that engaged seriously with what the ranch produced, eventually reaching a point at which continuation became impossible. Whether through financial pressure, institutional resistance, personal toll, or the specific quality of exhaustion that sustained proximity to this property's phenomenon produces in the people who experience it directly. Fugal absorbed all of that prior history before he committed the resources that purchasing and operating the investigation required. He understood that every program before his had stopped. He decided that understanding was a reason to build something more durable rather than a warning to reconsider. The production framework he established, the History Channel broadcast deal, the assembly of a scientific team anchored by Travis Taylor's aerospace and defense research credentials, the continuous monitoring infrastructure that gave the investigation a surveillance presence the prior programs had never sustained, was designed specifically to outlast whatever the ranch produced. It was designed to keep moving. The seasons that followed validated that design. The investigation documented aerial phenomenon, electromagnetic anomalies, underground structures, physical effects on crew members, and an escalating body of instrument data that would have ended any prior program within its first season, and that the Fugal operation absorbed, documented, and kept investigating. There was no lockdown when a crew member required medical evacuation. There was no lockdown when the drilling operation encountered resistance at depths whose correspondence to the sonar-mapped underground voids indicated the resistance was not geological. There was no lockdown when the perimeter cameras documented something approaching the property from outside the fence line, in a sequence whose 4 independent data streams the investigation's technical team could not account for conventionally. Through all of it, the gates stayed open. What the scientists confirmed this week closed them, and the specific nature of what they confirmed is what makes a lockdown decision from the man who has never made one the most significant single event in the modern history of the Skinwalker Ranch investigation. The scientists whose findings produced the lockdown decision were not members of the investigation's regular research team. They were brought onto the property specifically to assess a body of data that the investigation's existing scientific infrastructure had produced across the most recent investigation phase, and that Travis Taylor had determined required external validation before any conclusions about its implications could be responsibly drawn. The decision to bring in outside assessment was itself significant. Taylor's professional standards have always been high enough that the investigation's prior anomalous findings had been subjected to rigorous internal analysis before being presented to any outside party. The fact that this specific body of data was assessed internally and then referred for external validation rather than being processed within the normal analytical pipeline indicates that what the internal analysis produced was something Taylor's scientific discipline required him to verify independently before he was willing to act on it. The outside scientists brought to the ranch represented three specific disciplines whose combined relevance to what the investigation's instruments had been detecting was deliberate rather than coincidental. A geophysicist whose academic background included research into unusual electromagnetic propagation through subsurface geological formations. A physicist specializing in directed energy systems whose professional history included classified defense research programs operating in the same technical domain as several of Taylor's prior NASA projects. And a materials scientist whose laboratory had conducted independent analysis on physical samples recovered from the ranch's active zones in prior investigation phases. Samples whose compositional results had never been publicly discussed in any broadcast episode. The assessment framework the three outside scientists applied to the investigation's data was designed by Taylor to be as resistant to the conventional dismissal that anomalous findings at this property have historically received from outside institutions as his internal analysis methodology could make it. The instrument data was presented without its geographic and contextual provenance. The scientists assessed the readings as raw data before being told where the data was collected. What they confirmed when they reviewed that data, before they were told they were looking at Skinwalker Ranch measurements, is what produced the lockdown. The body of data that Taylor submitted to outside scientific assessment represents the accumulation of the investigation's most recent instrument readings across three specific measurement categories that have been the focus of the investigation's technical attention since the underground dimension of the ranch's phenomenon was established in the middle seasons of the broadcast record. The electromagnetic measurement data from the Mesa Zone covers a period of continuous monitoring whose duration and whose instrument density give it a statistical foundation that single-session anomalous readings cannot claim. What that longitudinal dataset shows is not a pattern of spikes and returns to baseline, the pattern that characterizes instrument response to transient environmental events. It shows a directional movement. The baseline itself is rising. The electromagnetic environment of the Mesa Zone has been measurably and consistently different from what it was at the beginning of the monitoring period, and the rate of that change has been accelerating across the most recent measurement sessions in a manner that the geophysicist brought in for the external assessment described in terms that the investigation's internal record captures with the specific quality of professional restraint that indicates a scientist choosing their words about an extraordinary finding very carefully. The underground vibration data from the drilling zone adds the second dimension of the assessment package. The vibration signatures logged by the sensors positioned at the boundaries of the underground void network have been showing a change in their structural characteristics across the recent measurement period, not in their frequency range, which has remained consistent with what the investigation established as the baseline for those sensors, but in their internal organization. The randomness metric applied to those signatures has been declining. The patterns they contain have been becoming less random over time in a progression whose statistical significance the outside assessment confirmed as real and whose conventional explanation the geophysicist was unable to provide. The third data stream is the one that Taylor has been most careful about in every public reference he has made to the current investigation phase: the thermal anomaly documentation from the perimeter monitoring network. What that documentation shows across the recent recording period is a change in the frequency and the proximity of anomalous thermal signatures at the ranch boundary that the perimeter program has been logging since its establishment. The signatures are appearing more often, they are appearing closer to the fence line, and they are appearing in the coordinated spatial distributions that the investigation's prior analysis established as the behavioral signature of whatever the perimeter cameras have been documenting. Distributions that the materials scientist brought in for the outside assessment noted, without being told anything about the prior investigation record, were inconsistent with any known animal behavior pattern in any terrestrial ecosystem she had previously encountered in her research work. The geophysicist's assessment of the underground data produced the finding that Taylor has described in the limited internal communications that have been referenced in accounts of the lockdown decision as the most technically significant result the outside assessment generated. Her professional background in electromagnetic propagation through subsurface geological formations gave her the analytical framework to engage with the Mesa Zone's underground data in a way that the investigation's prior geological consultants whose backgrounds were in surface geology and mining, had not been positioned to apply. What she found when she applied that framework to the combined electromagnetic and vibration data from the underground measurement network was a correspondence between the two data streams that the investigation's internal analysis had identified as potentially significant without being able to characterize technically. The electromagnetic readings and the vibration signatures from the underground sensor network are not independent. Their variations are correlated. Specific changes in the electromagnetic data are consistently followed by specific changes in the vibration data, and the relationship between those changes follows a pattern whose mathematical structure the geophysicist's analysis characterized as consistent with a coupled system rather than two independent phenomena occurring in the same location. A coupled system is a physical system in which two or more components interact with each other, in which the state of each component influences the state of the others. The electromagnetic environment and the physical vibration environment beneath the Skinwalker Ranch mesa are behaving as components of a coupled system. Whatever is generating the electromagnetic signal is connected to whatever is generating the vibration signatures. They are not two separate anomalous features of the underground environment. They are two expressions of the same thing. The geophysicist's characterization of what that thing might be is the element of her assessment that the investigation's internal record captures with the most carefully chosen language. She said that the coupled system's behavior was consistent with a system that was responding to an external input. The input she identified as the most likely candidate, based on the timing correlations between the coupled system's state changes and the surface-level events documented in the investigation's concurrent records, was the drilling operation. The underground coupled system responds to the drilling. Its responses are not random. They are structured, they are directional, and they are escalating in a manner that the geophysicist described as consistent with a system approaching a threshold state. What happens at that threshold, she declined to speculate about. What she confirmed is that the system is moving toward it. The physicist specializing in directed energy systems brought a professional framework to the assessment that no prior scientific consultant engaged by the Skinwalker Ranch investigation had possessed. His background in classified defense research involving directed electromagnetic energy, the development, deployment, and detection of systems that use focused electromagnetic radiation as operational instruments gave him a reference vocabulary for the electromagnetic data from the Mesa Zone that the investigation's internal analysis had been working without. What he said about the signal when he reviewed the data before being told where it was collected is the element of the outside assessment that has been described by people familiar with the lockdown decision as the finding that moved Brandon Fugal from concern to action. The signal's characteristics, the frequency range, the internal structure, the directional propagation pattern, and the specific relationship between its amplitude and its spatial distribution across the measurement network are consistent in the directed energy physicist's professional assessment with an intentionally generated signal rather than a naturally occurring one, not consistent as a possibility, consistent as the most technically supportable interpretation of the data. A naturally occurring electromagnetic signal generated by geological processes, atmospheric conditions, or any other conventional environmental source does not have the internal structure this signal has. Geological electromagnetic signatures are broadband and unstructured. Atmospheric signatures are variable and condition-dependent. What the Mesa Zone's instruments have been recording has neither of those characteristics. It has the characteristics of a signal that was designed. The directed energy physicist's professional experience with designed electromagnetic signals, with the technical specifications of intentionally generated directed energy in classified defense applications, gave him the framework to recognize those characteristics in the Mesa data and to describe what he recognized with the precision that his background demanded. He told the assessment team that the signal beneath the Skinwalker Ranch Mesa bore the technical hallmarks of a directed energy system operating in a frequency range and with an internal structure that no human technology he was aware of had been demonstrated to produce. Not similar to human technology, not reminiscent of human technology, beyond the demonstrated capability of any human technology he had professional knowledge of. That assessment, from a physicist whose classified defense research background gave him access to the full range of human-directed energy capability, is what the lockdown was built around. The materials scientist's role in the outside assessment was initially conceived as the most peripheral of the three, a supplementary validation of the physical evidence component of the investigation's findings rather than a primary analytical contribution to the assessment of the instrument data. What her engagement with the investigation's data produced was anything but peripheral. Her prior laboratory work on physical samples from the ranch's active zones zones, conducted under blind submission protocols similar to those used for the DNA analysis that other external assessments had applied to biological material from the property, had generated results that the investigation had held in its internal record without public disclosure. The assessment engagement gave her access to the full body of the investigation's physical evidence documentation for the first time, allowing her to contextualize the prior laboratory results against the instrument data that the other two scientists were assessing simultaneously. What that contextualization produced is the finding that the materials scientist has described in the limited accounts available from the assessment process as the one that stayed with her longest after she left the property. The physical evidence from the ranch's active zones, the compositional anomalies in material samples recovered from areas of concentrated electromagnetic activity, the thermal characteristics of objects documented in proximity to the underground void boundaries, and the structural properties of recovered material whose characteristics the prior laboratory analysis had not been able to account for conventionally, are consistent with the kind of material transformation that the directed energy physicist's signal assessment would predict. A directed energy system operating in the frequency range and with the intensity that the MESA data suggests would produce specific and identifiable effects on the physical materials in its operation field. The materials scientist found those effects in the physical evidence record. The correspondence between the signal characteristics the directed energy physicist identified and the material transformation signatures the materials scientist documented in the physical evidence is not incidental. It is the physical evidence that the signal is real, that it is operating at the intensity the instrument data indicates, and that it has been producing measurable effects on the physical environment of the ranch's active zones for a period of time whose beginning the materials analysis is not able to establish, because the evidence of transformation in the oldest samples the investigation has recovered is as advanced as the evidence in the most recent ones. Whatever is generating that signal has been generating it for longer than the investigation has been running. The materials scientist's contribution to the assessment was to confirm that the instrument data and the physical evidence are documenting the same phenomenon, and that the phenomenon has been operating on this property for a very long time. The combined findings of the three outside scientists were presented to Brandon Fugal in a formal assessment summary delivered at the end of the evaluation period. The accounts of people familiar with the presentation describe a meeting whose atmosphere was unlike any prior review session in the investigation's history, not because the findings were unexpected. Fugal and Taylor had understood the direction the data was pointing before the outside assessment was commissioned, but because having those findings confirmed by three independent scientists whose professional credentials placed them entirely outside the investigation's internal framework removed the last buffer between what the data had been suggesting and what the investigation was now required to treat as confirmed. Fugal's response to the assessment summary was not immediate. The accounts describe him spending an extended period reviewing the combined findings before speaking. When he did speak, the first thing he said was not about the science. It was about the people on the property, the crew members, the production staff, the technical team, everyone whose presence on the ranch in the current investigation phase constituted an ongoing exposure to a phenomenon that the outside assessment had just confirmed was operating at a scale and with an intentionality that none of the prior season's safety protocols had been designed around. The lockdown decision followed from that concern directly, not from the scientific implications of what the assessment had confirmed. Those implications were significant enough to occupy the investigation's analytical attention for a long time to come. From the immediate practical question of whether the people currently working on the property were doing so with adequate understanding of what the outside assessment had just established about the environment they were working in. Fugal's answer to that question was that they were not, and his response to that answer was the lockdown. The gates were closed, the active investigation was suspended, and the communication to the History Channel that followed, the communication that has produced the public acknowledgement of the lockdown that this video documents, was made with the directness of a man who has spent years carefully managing what he says about this property, and who has decided that this specific development is one that the audience the investigation has built across 5 seasons deserves to be told about honestly. A lockdown at Skinwalker Ranch is not a pause. It is not a production break or a scheduled hiatus in the investigation's operational calendar. The investigation that Brandon Fugal has been running since 2016 has never had a scheduled hiatus. The continuous monitoring infrastructure runs regardless of whether an active investigation team is on the property, and the data that infrastructure produces has driven the research agenda across every season without interruption. What the lockdown represents is a fundamental reassessment of the relationship between the investigation and the phenomenon it has been studying. A reassessment driven by the outside assessment's confirmation that the phenomenon is operating at a scale, with a technical sophistication, and with an apparent awareness of the investigation's activity that the prior 5 seasons' safety and operational frameworks were not built to account for. The specific operational changes the lockdown has produced are not fully in the public domain. What is known from the accounts available is that the active investigation team's presence on the property has been suspended pending the development of revised protocols that reflect what the outside assessment established about the electromagnetic environment in the active zones. The physical infrastructure changes that the lockdown has prompted. The assessment of the current monitoring equipment safety specifications against the signal intensity the directed energy physicist confirmed. The evaluation of the crew's prior exposure history against the materials scientists' findings about the physical transformation effects the signal produces represent an operational overhaul of a kind that the investigation has never previously undertaken. What the lockdown also represents for the investigation's public record is a communication whose significance the audience that has followed the show across 5 seasons is fully equipped to understand. Brandon Fugal has never closed the gates before. He has never suspended active investigation for any reason. The fact that he has done so now, in response to a scientific assessment whose findings he has chosen to characterize publicly rather than manage privately, communicates something specific about what the assessment confirmed that is separate from and more significant than any technical description of the findings themselves. It communicates that whatever has been operating beneath and around Skinwalker Ranch has been confirmed as something that the people getting close to it need to approach differently than they have been. That communication is the most honest thing the investigation has produced in 5 seasons of remarkable honesty, and it deserves to be heard. Every program that has ever investigated Skinwalker Ranch has eventually stopped. The Shermans left. NIDS wound down. AWSAP classified its findings and went quiet. What made Fugal different was that he never stopped. Until now, the lockdown is not a failure of the investigation. It is the investigation's most honest moment, the point at which the man who built the most sophisticated research operation this property has ever seen looked at what 3 independent scientists confirmed and decided that continuing without acknowledging what they found would be the wrong kind of courage. The signal beneath the mesa is real, it is intentional, it is escalating, and it has been operating on this property for longer than anyone has been keeping records. Brandon Fugal locked the gates because the science demanded it. What the science confirmed is what every prior program encountered and chose not to say out loud. The next phase of this investigation will be the first one that approaches the ranch knowing exactly what it is dealing with. That changes everything about what comes next.